Okay, so for my final book, I did not write, oh my gosh, that's a huge falsehood. I read Shamanism, Racism, and Hip-Hop Culture, Essays on White Supremacy and Black Subversion. So this is published in 2005, so it's pretty contemporary, and I just did a little looking into the author, James W. Perkinson. Perkinson has published like a ton of works, and he's a professor of ethics and systematic theology, which is, having known that and looking at like other things that he's written, it's really important to keep that background in mind and those like degrees and skill sets that he has and lenses for understanding the way in which he approaches race. So I started to read this book and I was like, wait, I have to stop because I realized I knew nothing about shamanism. And so shamanism.com describes shamanism as, and this is, I felt, a pretty good description of shamanism because it shows the differences in shamanism in one definition, but shamanism is an ancient healing tradition and moreover a way of life. It is used to connect with nature and all of creation. The word shaman originates from the Tungus tribe in Siberia. Anthropologists coined this term and have used it to refer to the spiritual and ceremonial leadership or leaders among indigenous cultures worldwide. The word shamanism can be used to describe the ancient spiritual practices of these indigenous cultures. Clearly, the countless similarities between various ancient traditions played a role in the continual generalization of the word. So it can be used in reference to things that have happened historically or like its existence historically and like also how it permeates today. So the website also listed the key aspects of shamanism, which are also very important to note. So it's connection with nature, healing of self and community, spiritual practice, pilgrimage to sacred places, and vision and ceremony. So going forward, this is like easily this is like the most challenging books I've ever read in high school or college. And the language is really, really advanced, and it's absolutely written for an academic audience. And the title is really misleading. I talked to Tobin a little bit about it because I thought it would be something more like a Coates writing that's like more narrative. Speaking as the whole title, when it's not abbreviated, is Essays on White Supremacy and Black Subversion, which I thought was really cool, though, to now have read some African American studies theory, because that's not something that I've even heard a lot of, and this is like my first introduction to it. So it was pretty good, but definitely tricky moving forward, which sort of was like a barrier in my understanding. So full disclaimer that my personal comprehension could be off, but I'm going forward with it. So the way that it starts, there's like probably 5 or 6 sections. It really exposes like the early thought process of white supremacy and the implications of like European Christianity leading to like witch hunting. And so when you look at blackness tied into shamanism, it was used to demonize African Americans in a way that was not just exclusive to race, it also incorporated religion. And that absolutely carried over when people colonized in the United States. It was that same mindset of that like European Christianity. And it was strange because it's hypocritical in terms of like viewing shamanism and people of color as essentially witches and demonizing those people, but in doing so they sort of created their whole own ideology of like what witchcraft was by creating a witch hunt through demonizing people of color. So then it progresses today, and it's really interesting to see the connection when you think about it with that background that you get in the beginning of the theory. It's really, really dense, so it's hard, I guess, to summarize all of this theory. But when it progresses today, the author, Perkinson, cites the longevity of life. And actually, there was a study done that African Americans and as well as Native American people often receive more invasive and radical procedures for the same diagnoses and at the same stages as those who are Caucasian. And it sort of suggests that even in like a healthcare setting, that people of color are used experimentally in terms of like that boundary that was set so long ago by demonizing people of color and treating them in a witchcrafty, I guess, type way, that we're able to dehumanize them. And yeah, so value was really stolen by people of color, from people of color, by demonizing them, and like a secondary, I guess, form of witchcraft. And yeah, so again, police brutality also can be tied into this, which they also suggest, which obviously people of color are disproportionately exposed to. And it again suggests that this age-old like religious demonization proves like a necessity for force and for almost civilization, which is like a really gross term to use, but it's often used in terms historically of how they spoke about Native Americans, because of the way that religion and race were tied into use to other people so long ago and are still used today. Then it progresses on to address hip hop, and it was less explicit on hip hop than I thought it would, given like it being one of the primary facets of the title. It really took them a while to get into like hip hop, but one of my favorite quotes from the book reads, "While much of hip hop culture has indeed been subverted from within and without into preoccupation with machismo, misogyny, and predatory violence, there remains at its core a codification of death, both dared and defied, that continues to echo transcendent and tragic power." And I think that gave like a really, really incredible definition of what hip hop is. And oftentimes I've heard in like certain discourse communities about the value of hip hop culture and like what it is in its entirety. And I think that's a really good way to show it in its entirety in a very short sentence. And I just thought that line was really beautiful and captivating. So overall, the strengths of this book, it is awesome to have theory in African American studies, and it gives you some sort of level-headedness to balance any personal theory that you may have, and to look to see that these questions are being asked in other places and by academics and people who not necessarily have answers, but potentially better answers or more keyed-in answers. I've never thought of race in such a way, because I didn't have that background as to how it was tied into Christianity in that sense, in terms of witchcraft. I really always found witchcraft to be, especially being from where I am from, is like a white lady type thing. So understanding like how it interacts with race is really, really interesting. My perceived weaknesses for the books were the title was misleading, and that's just a personal spite thing because I thought it was going to be a little different than what it was, but I'm really glad to have read it. However, I think that a lot of the essays were very, very long and challenging to follow, and again, with the language being pretty elevated, it can be pretty inaccessible to a lot of people, and it's definitely not meant for people who don't have an academic background, or even a background in shamanism. That was like a huge barrier for me personally. And then also when talking about theory, it's important to acknowledge like the race and class barriers in theory itself. Theory is often thought to be controversial because it can exist as just a work of privilege and is inaccessible for so many people, whether it be due to language, just surely how expensive purchasing a lot of theory books are, etc. So, and a lot of times the people who are writing theory, like Perkinson, is a white man, and a lot of people that's really controversial to, and that's a lot of theory is a lot of people who are removed from the demographics that they're writing about, and so that also is another thing that leaves a poor taste in people's mouths for theory and makes it inaccessible for a lot of people. Yeah.
Questions for our presenter?
Could you repeat the quote one more time?
Yeah, sure. It says, "While much of hip-hop culture has indeed been subverted from within and without into a preoccupation of machismo, misogyny, and predatory violence, there remains at its core a codification of death, both dared and defied, that continues to echo with transcendent and tragic power.
Did he, or who wrote the book?
James W. Perkinson.
Okay. Did he go into any hip hop artists that are differing from the first part of that definition nowadays?
Not specifically. When talking about hip hop, I should have added this when I was talking about it earlier and included this stuff with the definition. He talks a lot about capitalism and how capitalism is exploitive and took advantage of hip hop culture and hip hop music, which is like predominantly created by people of color. So that's sort of where that was keyed into. Yeah.
So he didn't like explicitly talk about hip hop artists and hip hop and its content, but really just how it fed into capitalism.
Yeah. See, I thought, yeah, that's the thing. That was another thing I thought I'd be more explicit about hip hop. But
he's known for his contributions to helping us understand the way that not only race but whiteness itself is inextricably tied to religious practices.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find that part of his argument convincing?
I did. I mean, like, now understand it. It was, yeah. I hadn't looked at race through the perspective of religion this far back. Like, I had always thought about race and religion oftentimes, like, during the slavery era, and, like, it's prominent during the civil rights movement, but I never thought of how it would be connected so far back in the history. And yeah, I was interested because I was like, he's not technically like a professor of history, he studies theology, and so that was really important, I think, for understanding this book, and I thought it was very, very convincing. Yeah, for sure.
Did this book influence your own personal thoughts about hip-hop?
I would say it did not. I think it more so changed my focus on like religion and race, but I think, I don't know, if you hadn't thought about like capitalism and capitalism being exploitive and seeing how capitalism has taken advantage of hip hop music and hip hop culture, I think that could be like a really shocking piece of information for someone and could definitely change someone's perspective. I think it's definitely worth reading though. It's really heavy, but I really enjoyed it.
Other questions?
When you're talking about theory, you're talking about critical race theory. You said African American theory. I was just like a little, like what you were talking about a little bit.
Yeah.
This theory.
I guess you could say, critical race theory, but I guess it's just like race and religious theory.
Okay.
Yeah, he's more theological in his orientation. He writes as a professing Christian,
Mm-hmm.
but he's trying to reach a broader audience through his work. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would definitely agree, which is unfortunate because the audience I feel like he's going to reach is impacted greatly by the language, but I don't know how he could make such a compelling argument without using the language that he does.
Yeah, he's actually, I think I'm remembering correctly, he's a spoken word poet as well, so he does these spoken word performances, and you can see that in the writing. He just gets lost in the language at points.
They're very large pieces of writing.
Does he have like run-on sentences and stuff? Like
They're not run-on sentences, they're just long, involved, complex articulation of thought that goes on for a while. Yeah.
Comments. Lots of comments.
Comments
are
very Other questions for our presenter? All right, another round of applause.